Science writ large is just a tool. So it can be used incredibly poorly, it can be ineffective, and it can do a lot of damage to animals. So I think the real question is like, in what way, how can you practice science? What are the foundational principles in science? So developing sort of like an ethical framework that can help scientists understand how to generate the kind of work that actually is going to make positive change and shift attitudes and behaviors towards being more animal friendly and more animal protective. And so I think that's the foundation. When we're talking about science that directly interfaces with animals, we need to begin actually before the science and look at the ethical frameworks, build up from there, and then we can start generating these rich scientific profiles that are, carry the authority of science for better or worse, that is necessary for some of the decision making in society, to have that scientific authority behind the information that we're generating that is premised on understanding animals as fully, realized individuals with personalities and social relationships. That's going to change the kind of data that we generate. And so that sort of data, I think, is going to be much more useful for informing and shaping policy and law. So I think that's for, that is one set of answers that is related to science that's directly interfacing with animals. And then I think there's a whole other set of answers that is related to one step removed from directly interfacing with the animals themselves. And one of the things that I've become very interested in recently is using science to both sort of provide some accountability to the effects of the science that we're generating. So actually using science to understand and model what is happening globally to all the animals in captivity, in the wild, in laboratories, in homes. Understanding we don't even know the numbers in a lot of these cases, but we actually haven't even been tracking where we started from and where we might be going. And then similarly, to use a similar modeling approach to try to map out the effects of different policies. So if we choose policy A, trying to actually assess and model what would happen to animals and their welfare and their well-being and how many individuals would be affected, versus policy B, so that it can help inform decision-making around law and policy.
It's pretty obvious that science has and will continue to contribute a lot to animal protection. In the sense that when we, for example, come to learn that animals are sentient, they have agency, they suffer, their lives can go better and worse, all of that stuff which we learn about from animal behaviorists, from cognitive ethologists, from comparative psychologists, has huge implications for how we should treat animals and how the law should treat animals. When you come to think, for example, that those chickens and those cows on factory farms are not just, quote, production units, as they're often thought about in animal agriculture, but actually real, sentient, feeling, living things, then that's bound to change the attitude that you should have towards whether they should be protected and whether they have a welfare that's worth taking seriously. I also think, though, that there's a lot of separation between scientists and lawyers. It goes back again to them in some ways being kind of temperamentally different sorts of people. But it also has to do with just the way that in American society we all tend to live in our echo chambers and in our silos, and it becomes very difficult to reach across those kinds of boundaries, even when there can be enormous benefit in mutual cooperation.
Animal cognition research, specifically, has really become the darling of animal legal advocacy, and for good reason, because it has helped us get really significant changes for animals legally. With respect to science and animal protection more generally, however, the situation is a little bit more complicated. There are three kinds of scientific research involving animals. The first kind tries to find out about animals' experience and capacities for its own sake. The second tries to find out about animals in order to use them better. So This kind of research comes under the category of animal production science. And this kind of research looks at animals as biological units of production. So an example of this would be, research on how to get cows to lactate earlier, before puberty. So the third kind of research is research on animals to try to find out about other things. For instance, research to develop new drugs and new products. The thing is, the majority of research involving animals is in these latter two categories. And in these two categories, this research is largely outside animal cruelty protections. And in the case of animal production science, it's almost entirely outside of any kind of welfare regulation at all. So the thing about science and animal protection is a little bit more complicated, because science can really support better outcomes for animals, but it can also be the thing that enables us to harm them. The thing is, I guess, lawyers can't really dictate to scientists what they pursue or the questions that they ask. But if I could reach across that divide, I would challenge the researchers in the first category, that is the animal cognition researchers, to expand their subjects, to include the animals that are being held in our food production systems, like chickens and pigs. And I would challenge the researchers in the last two categories of animal science production research and other kinds of scientific research on animals to expand their inquiries, to include questions about the animals' experiences of the practices that they are researching.
Science really kind of forms the foundation for animal protection, right? It's science that tells us that we need to care about the interests of animals in the first place, that they have so many of these same capacities that we have as humans, that we once thought were sort of uniquely human, right? They can feel joy and experience pain and sorrow and grief and jealousy and all of these things that make us feel like we need to care about them and consider their interests under the law and treat them differently from how we might treat other regulatory objects like books or liquor or land. We know that animals are different, and science is what tells us that animals are different and demands that we sort of take that into consideration when designing laws that affect them. So I think that's sort of the most fundamental way. But I think science also can motivate the need for new laws when there's new scientific discoveries. It can sort of shape public opinion and set the stage for these kinds of social change that we need to see legal change and new regulations put in place. So it can really change the way that we view other species and also our own. And I think it is also a means of sort of making the law more current.
That it's increasingly important as an environmental scientist that my work stays relevant to legal advocates in areas like animal protection and environmental advocacy. In some ways, environmental science can actually run aground of animal protection. But if we look really closely and we stay kind of faithful to the evidence, we actually see surprising ways that animal and environmental protection are compatible and help reinforce one another. Well, what do I mean by that? Some of the most welfare-friendly ways to raise animal, like free-range, pasture-fed, and slower-growing breeds of chickens, actually have a larger environmental cost associated with them, because growing animals more slowly over longer periods of time means you have to raise more animals over greater periods to produce the same amount of meat. So you can actually be increasing the amount of resource use and the impact on the natural environment. But if you look really closely, you also realize that these slower growing way of raising animals also requires us to raise more animals in farming systems. So while we might be marginally improving an individual chicken's welfare, we're also subjecting potentially many more of them to animal confinement and being raised in semi-intensive practices. So, our work has helped shed light on this and actually can be used to help with policy as well as corporate commitments for animal and environmental protection, to remind people to say, hey, if you want higher welfare standards for individual animals, that's incredibly important, but we also have to think about reducing the total number of animals in the system that you're selling or serving or farming.
Here, I know we're talking not purely about science and the scientific method, but empiricism generally. And I feel like you really need empiricism, at least in the US legal system, for any kind of argument. You have to bring forth data and facts. And so the science is a necessary but insufficient condition for the law. We know we have an abundance of science, and again, our legal institutions are much further behind. They're not addressing a lot of the problems that we see or are clear from the data, climate change being one of the most obvious, but also, of course, enormous forms of pollution from animal agriculture, for instance. And instead what we see is agricultural exceptionalism in the law. And so you can't expect that if you do good science, the law will inevitably listen. But if there isn't good science, I feel like there's very little chance of having good laws.
Science is incredibly important for the animal protection movement and can make a huge contribution to building more effective strategies in the animal advocacy movement. By setting up collaborations between scientists and animal advocacy organizations, we can actually build really strategic interventions that have been tested first in the lab maybe, and then in the real world to see if they're actually working. That would help us to really figure out what types of interventions need to be rolled out on a larger scale, what types of messages would work. But at this point, we really don't know that much about what is effective and what is not. So once we find out what is really working for certain target audiences, we can actually spend a lot more resources on those. But at the same time, it's very important also to find out what is not working at the moment. Every animal advocacy organization are doing a variety of different campaigns without really collecting evidence or evaluating those campaigns to see whether it actually changed any of the behaviors that they're trying to change.
With having my mind changed by new science that came out is indicative of one really important role for science to play. The other important role, of course, is generating evidence for issues that we know now to be major issues, such as animal welfare, right, and the treatment of animals and animal protection. We need science, and even more importantly, I would say we need organizations and entities that are willing to support science on ethical questions. For example, right, what do animals feel? What do they think? What are their societies like? What does it mean to be sentient? We need the science on these topics, and therefore we need support for the sciences on those topics as well too. So that's funding, but it's also events like the Brooks Congress that bring people together to talk about these issues. So that's another really important role for not just science, but the scientific enterprise within animal protection, right, is to generate evidence towards animal protection. The other quick thing I'll say as a scientist is, in addition to more science to provide more evidence, we also need more exposure. I think one thing I learned in my career is how little I was exposed to science on animal protection, or even just the role of animals in our lives. It was only when I got to my current department that I was exposed in this interdisciplinary way by talking to not just other scientists, but people in other sciences, right? People who study animal psychology, people who study animal welfare, I was not, as a scientist, I was not exposed to that kind of science. So we actually need more scientists from different scientific fields talking together to advance animal protection. And we need to expose young scientists to studies and evidence coming from these other fields in order to get them to understand that these problems exist and to actually start working on them. There are so many great minds out there in the sciences that, like me, just not that I was a great mind, but there are many great minds in the sciences, young minds, who are actually not really being exposed to information on animals, and therefore are not in a position to protect them. But if they were exposed more to that research, they'd be able to engage with it, and they might actually, as scientists, but as people, start to care a bit more.
Science has clearly provided the foundation for the case for animal rights. So if you look at, how we know how animals suffer, we know that confining them in laboratories, for instance, is incredibly harmful to both their physical and psychological health. Science has shown us that animal testing is ineffective, it's cruel, there are better methods available. So that has provided the foundation for the policy and legal changes we need to make. I think now the next step is using social science to understand how to best persuade people on the street, scientists, lawmakers, to make the policy and legal changes we need to see to protect animals.
I'm really interested in the idea of whether scientific results, especially science of animal behavior, can be used to help people working in animal protection, help people working in animal law. As a scientist, I would say that right now, I'm not certain how much of science can be used, or at least scientific results can be used profitably, although it's beginning to be. What would be useful is if scientists had any understanding at all of the types of things that people in animal protection and people in animal law could need from science. In other words, what types of things would be useful in considering animal representation of various sorts? Is it answering questions about animals' choices, what they want to do, how they show us what they want? Is it answering questions about animals' self-awareness or understanding of themselves or others? Is it answering questions about how animals show us how they experience their own lives, right? So if we have a better understanding as scientists about the types of questions that would be usefully answered to help protect animals, I think science could rise to that occasion and try to answer them. As right now, scientists are answering questions about animal lives which don't generate from animal protection questions. They come from comparative psychological questions, just questions that humans have about non-humans. They're looking at animals to see how animal bodies and minds respond to things which we might want to put humans through. They're not doing research with animal protection in mind, but that could change, and then I think the results that we generate would be highly relevant to representing animals in animal law and advocating for animals.
There are many ways in which scientific evidence and knowledge contributes to animal protection. In many cases, people just misunderstand what animals are like, and they underestimate animals, and they think that conditions that are clearly not good enough for them, that are clearly not meeting their welfare needs, are good enough. And science can be very important in challenging those misconceptions. It can show us things about the harms that certain ways of raising animals do to those animals. And it can also expand our horizons in that it can get us to think seriously about animals that we might neglect because they're very small or very unfamiliar. Think here about fish, octopuses, crabs, lobsters, insects. We often struggle to empathize with these animals because they look so different from us, and they are so distant from us in evolutionary terms. But science can help here. Science can get us to see these animals in a new way, take them seriously as sentient beings that think and feel and have lives of their own.
There are two really important ways in which scientific research on animals
can contribute to work on animal protection. And one of those is certainly scientific research on animal standing in the law. So, for example, if the jurisdiction has the view that sentience is what's relevant, the scientific research can provide evidence that animals are sentient. Both philosophical evidence and scientific evidence has to work together in this regard, because sentience is not something that we can directly measure. We do not know what feeling good or feeling bad amounts to, and we don't have a scientific theory about that, so we really need to rely on the philosophy as well. So that's one kind of question about standing in the law that both philosophy and science needs to work together to answer. There's a second question about standing in the law. For example, if the jurisdiction is concerned about personhood, then the science can inform whether or not animals have whatever those features are that are relevant for personhood. Here again, surprisingly, perhaps, philosophy also plays an important role, because philosophy's work is doing conceptual analysis about what a person is. So what are those properties that an animal would have to have in order to be a person? With that philosophical work done, then the science can go and investigate things like, oh, does the animal form relationships? Is the animal rational? And things like this that might be relevant to personhood. So that's all one way in which science can inform animal protection and especially legal work that is helping to determine standing for an animal. But the second way I think is really important and sometimes is overlooked. And this is, once you know that the animal has standing, what are the animal's actual interests? We need to know what those are in order to figure out what it means to protect the animal, support the animal, and give the animal what it needs to fulfill its rights, or to thrive or to flourish. And so this really requires a host of different kinds of scientific research. So for example, comparative cognition research is going to be relevant here, looking to see, again, what are the cognitive capacities of the animal, so we can help to figure out whether something matters to an animal or not. Can they think about what happened in the past? Do they relive past experiences? Can this help, would this potentially create trauma experiences for the animal? Or does the animal not have episodic memory, in which cases trauma might not be as important a thing? This is going to be a relevant question when deciding what matters to an animal and what doesn't matter to an animal. So there's the whole cognition piece, but then there's also scientific research on wild animal behavior. There's a host of research that I think is really important for figuring out specific policies when we're looking at protecting animal interests legally.